The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was merely the opening salvo in a much broader Japanese operation across the Pacific. Almost simultaneously, Japanese forces attacked American possessions at Wake Island, Guam, in the Philippines, and British possessions at Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya. And just a few weeks later, the Japanese invaded another British colony when they moved into Burma. Though often forgotten in the broader context of the war, what was called the China-Burma-India Theater saw fierce and important fighting, including some of the most effective intelligence and guerrilla work of the war under the United States' new Office of Strategic Services and their Detachment 101. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Prior to the declaration of war, the United States had been supporting Chinese forces against the Japanese, prompted especially by the news of the 1937 Nanjing Massacre. The famous Lend-Lease program was extended to China on May 6, 1941, and $846 million would make its way to China, including 110,864 tons of supplies, by April of 1942. In addition to that assistance, the United States had steadily increased pressure on Japan through the use of sanctions. Those actions, along with Japan's territorial ambitions throughout Asia, helped to inspire the preemptive attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 22, 1941, Japanese forces invaded British Burma. Though British plans for defense of the region existed, war with Germany meant that the British couldn't spare troops to defend the colony, and British command decided to prioritize India anyway. They considered Burma a military backwater that wasn't at serious risk for invasion. The Japanese saw it differently. Supplies and support for China traveled primarily along the Burma Road, making it a vital artery for support of the war in China. At the time of the invasion, the British command in Burma had only 2 divisions available for defense. The United States and United Kingdom requested assistance from the leader of nationalist Chinese, or Kuomintang, forces, Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese Expeditionary Force, made up of 2 Chinese armies, was formed to relieve other Allied forces and put under the command of American Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell. The Allied goal to defend the Burma Road ended in dismal failure, and Allied forces retreated into India at the end of April, leaving Burma in the hands of the Japanese. It would be years before the Allies could retake the region, but they wouldn't sit idly by in the meantime. On April 14, 1942, the Coordinator of Information, an agency which would soon evolve into the Office of Strategic Services, activated Detachment 101 for action behind enemy lines in Burma. Working with Stilwell, OSS head William Donovan formed the detachment with the twofold assignment of espionage and guerrilla warfare in Japanese-occupied Burma. The unit is often cited as the first unit in U.S. military history created specifically for conducting unconventional warfare operations behind enemy lines. The official history of the unit describes some of the difficulties the detachment faced. The country represents the densest kind of jungle terrain, and for half the year is rain-sodden and malaria-infested. The Japanese confined their movement almost entirely to night marches and employed illogical courses of action to conceal their whereabouts and intentions. And, of course, there was the conspicuousness of American agents among the local population, and that was beside the threat of deadly cobras and kraits and tigers. The unit was formed initially with about 24 men under the command of Major Carl Eifler. Eifler had experience doing undercover work with the United States Customs Patrol to catch smugglers and was recommended for the job by General Stilwell. The other recruits were generally chosen by personal acquaintance. Eifler brought men from his regiment, who also chose trusted officers. The small group arrived in India in July and were sent by General Stilwell, nicknamed Vinegar Joe for his temper, to go to Burma and destroy bridges that were supplying an airbase in northern Burma that was harassing the supply planes flying over the Himalayas, the infamous hump to supply China. Stilwell allegedly dismissed Eifler with the order, "I don't want to see you again until I hear a boom from Burma." When the Japanese invaded, many Burmese joined them against their colonial rulers, forming units that pushed the British out in favor of promised autonomy under the Japanese. However, there were notable exceptions, especially among the Kachin peoples of northern Burma who supported the British. The Kachins had been viciously attacked by Japanese and other Burmese forces even during the invasion. British officers commanded a number of Kachin, many of whom lived in incredibly remote mountain villages called the Northern Kachin Levies. It took months for the detachment to fully train and begin its first operations. They set up a base in Assam just across the border from Burma and began training native Burmese as intelligence agents, radio operators, and saboteurs, drawing from the many refugees which had fled the year before. They designed their own portable radios, 50 pounds apiece, and made from the aluminum belly skins from crashed planes and capacitors fashioned out of sea ration cans, which they dubbed the Burma Radio. They could transmit 1,500 miles. Working with the Air Transport Command, which was responsible for flying over the hump, the 1st Infiltration Unit, 12 men known as A Group, were parachuted into Burma on January 26th and 27th, 1943. In exchange for the use of the planes, the detachment added to their list of duties finding and rescuing downed airmen. They set about setting Composition C charges, the family of plastic explosives that includes C4. The charges used a chemical delay fuse that could be set to go off several days after the charges were placed. In these initial attacks, Detachment 101 saw its first casualty to a Japanese patrol. Still, they blew up a bridge and severely damaged sections of the railway supplying the Japanese airbase. The early operations struggled. Another early drop was ambushed by local villagers. 3 of the 6 men dropped were killed, the others captured. Yet another group landed via boat, but dropped a battery that was later discovered. The whole group was rounded up, tortured, and killed. Vincent Curl was the Detachment 101 man who got in touch with Kachin resistance forces in the area and began arming them with American weapons. At their height, the OSS would lead around 10,000 Kachin guerrillas, including the most famous, the Kachin Rangers. The Kachin also brought in an enormous amount of intelligence about the Japanese forces. They built small airstrips to bring in Allied agents and supplies. The Kachin even built huts that could be placed on the airfield so that the Japanese planes would only see a village. But when the Allied planes came to land, the huts could simply be carried out of the way. The OSS also began designating targets for the 10th Air Force, and by the end of 1943, 80% of the 10th Air Force targets in the area resulted from OSS information. This included some of the hidden fighter bases the Japanese had built, where Zeros would be carefully hidden in pits. The Kachin forces regularly ambushed Japanese patrols, designed traps to catch them unaware. They planted sharp bamboo sticks at an angle along paths where they made their ambushes. When they first attacked, the Japanese along the path would dive for cover and straight onto the dagger-sharp sticks. One OSS agent described such an attack. The action was quick. The Japanese platoon-sized force of about 50 men entered the site, and in 5 minutes, all were dead. Eifler was a hands-on commander and was injured several times, survived 2 plane crashes, and had his head dashed against a rock in rough water, retrieving the remnants of OSS rubber rafts. He was finally replaced for medical reasons with Lieutenant Colonel Ray Piers. Eifler returned to the U.S. known as the Deadliest Colonel. The combined OSS force was incredibly successful. According to their own tallies, they accounted for 5,428 known enemy dead and an estimated 10,000 others either killed or seriously wounded. Official statistics show that they rescued between 232 and 574 downed Allied airmen. Detachment 101 never exceeded 700 Americans, about 100 officers with the remainder enlisted men. Even with thousands of guerrillas, they faced 6 Japanese divisions, around 150,000 men in Burma, along with support forces in the Imperial Air Force. Their actions helped clear the way for Stilwell's operation in the region, including the construction of the Lido Road to replace the lost Burma Road and to screen for his other units, including the British Chindit Raiders, Merrill's Marauders, and Stilwell's Chinese units. By 1944, those units were advancing through Burma, and OSS intelligence was vital. They cut off enemy supply lines and communication, ambushed Japanese forces, and provided scouts to lead Allied forces through the jungles. By then, the detachment was heavily involved all over the country, wrangling an enormous amount of intelligence and a large network of guerrillas. The OSS was instrumental in the success of Stilwell's North Burma campaign, which bogged down against Japanese resistance for 3 months in a brutal siege. Lieutenant Colonel Piers assumed responsibility for all operations, which other units are not prepared to undertake. Piers kept his units in positions where they can watch and report on every move of the enemy for our intelligence reports to air fighter and ground commands. They supplied 85% of all intelligence that Stilwell's forces received. By June of 1944, the guerrilla forces reached their largest size. Armed with American Thompsons, carbines, and BARs, the Kachin were experts at locating an enemy force and opening up with everything they had, but only for 5 or 10 minutes, before disappearing back into the jungle. The guerrilla forces prevented the Japanese from using the jungles to avoid other conventional Allied forces. During the siege, when Japanese units attempted to flee downriver, the Kachin units would ambush the rafts. The Kachins occupied one position in the river for nearly 2 months. 101 reported that the enemy was like clay pigeons for our marksmen on the banks. The detachment prevented the Japanese from slipping away from the siege. Under constant pressure, the Japanese position in North Burma unraveled. After the siege, the Marauders and Chindits were disbanded, but Detachment 101 continued, intercepting Japanese elements and preventing them from regrouping. Securing North Burma also secured the hump, and Allied tonnage increased from 13,000 tons a month in May 1944 to nearly 40,000 tons in November. Though they hardly did it alone, the OSS forces were a force multiplier, tying up Japanese forces. The detachment also helped some of the Burmese nationalists switch their allegiance to the Allies after they became disillusioned with the Japanese promises of independence. It was a 101 agent who took a representative from the Burmese Liberation Army to British command via an OSS-built airstrip. In the 4 years that it existed, Detachment 101 destroyed 51 bridges, derailed 9 trains, destroyed 277 enemy vehicles, and destroyed some 15,000 tons of enemy supplies. Their actions presaged and trailblazed tactics for special forces units like the Green Berets and proved vital to a theater of war that is often forgotten. Piers would later write that a special medal, the Citation for Military Assistance, was created uniquely for the detachment and awarded for feats of outstanding gallantry. By some accounts, the award itself was actually a mistake. A radio message that advised rewarding heroic Kachins was misinterpreted with the common abbreviation for CAMA, CMA, and that was read as CMA medals. When they couldn't find any information on the medal, the OSS created one from scratch to present to their Kachin allies. Former Detachment 101 officer Joseph Lazarski estimated that fewer than 50 of the medals were awarded. A campaign badge was also created, given to all Kachin Rangers who had served with distinction against the enemy, which, Piers writes, cost about $2 each to manufacture, but were prized by the Kachins. Piers notes, the effect was tremendous. They were being treated as equals, not as mercenaries. They could hardly restrain their tears. What is possibly most incredible about this force's success in the face of leeches, malaria, monsoon, and tigers was its shockingly small cost. Fewer than 30 U.S. personnel were killed, largely in plane crashes, and somewhere between 184 and 330 natives killed. A 1946 War Department report noted that in an engagement in the spring of 1945, 400 Rangers met 700 Japanese veterans supported by artillery, and in a 12-hour battle, killed 281 of the enemy, while suffering only 7 casualties. The unit has been credited with the highest kill-loss ratio of any infantry-type unit in American military history. In the end, their success led them to be called the most effective tactical combat force in the OSS. Detachment 101 was deactivated on July 12, 1945, after all of Burma was securely in Allied hands. Detachment 101 pioneered many aspects of unconventional warfare, proving the utility of espionage and guerrilla tactics against occupying forces. Faced with significant difficulty, the unit's brilliant and resourceful officers, enlisted men, and native guerrilla fighters found success through trial and error, and ultimately proved to be an effective force. Without them, it's difficult to assess what kind of success Stilwell's forces would have had in the region. Piers said of them, they were the fighters who raised the flag of freedom in the jungles of Burma. As guerrillas, they never lost a battle. On January 17, 1946, the efforts of Detachment 101 were recognized by General Dwight Eisenhower, then Chief of Staff of the United States Army, who presented the detachment with the Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation. The citation reads, "The courage and fighting spirit displayed by the officers and men of Service Unit Detachment 101, Office of Strategic Services, in this successful offensive action against overwhelming enemy strength reflect the highest traditions of the armed forces of the United States." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.